You're listening to episode 181 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Myoan Grace Schireson joins us to speak about the distinguishing characteristics of providing guidance in meditation and how to avoid becoming a student's therapist. One of the many challenges a meditation teacher can face is that sometimes our role as teachers become tangled with providing therapy. It's a very common occurrence, but without proper training, rather than reducing suffering for self and others, we may inadvertently increase it. So how do we recognize that line is being approached? And what can we do to skillfully move things in a beneficial direction for everyone involved? Abbess Myoan Grace Schireson is the founder and head teacher of the Empty Nest Zen Group, Modesto Valley Heartland Zen Group, and the Fresno River Zen Group. Grace is a Dharma heir in the lineage of Shunryo Suzuki Roshi, founder of the San Francisco Zen Center. Grace has practiced Zen meditation for more than 35 years, and is author of the book Zen Women Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters. In the United States, she has undergone her Soto Zen training with Sojun Mel Weitzman Roshi of Berkeley Zen Center, from whom she received Dharma transmission in 2005. Grace has also trained in Rinzai Zen in Japan under Keido Fukushima Roshi, retired abbot of Tofukuji Monastery located in Kyoto. She has taught classes on Zen throughout the United States and has also been trained as a clinical psychologist, teaching Asian methods of quieting the mind using techniques suitable for Westerners. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice gyokuru tea, Grace's favorite. Our guest today is Myoan Grace Schireson. Grace, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on.
When last we spoke with you about gender equality issues, that was a number of episodes ago, and today we're going to speak about the difference between one-on-one guidance in a meditation practice and therapy. Now, Grace, you live in both of these worlds, integrating them into your life as a Zen teacher, but also you have done work as a clinical psychologist. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I have practiced as a clinical psychologist. I've had a private practice, and I've also worked in agencies with children, family, and adults. So actually, it was quite a relief for me to recognize the difference between the two. Because when I did therapy, when I worked as a psychologist, I needed to actually make sure that people got better. However we defined an improvement in their mental state, in their moods, in their ability to function, that was part of the medical requirement and oftentimes the insurance requirement. I had to show that people were actually improving, whereas that is not a requirement as a Zen teacher. You teach people how to practice, and the responsibility is theirs to take on the practice to address their suffering. So it was actually quite a relief to feel that it was not my responsibility to see that people took to the practice or took responsibility for the ways that they suffered and that they changed in according to their Zen practice. So that was a relief for me.
Now, I understand that you train others in this very important topic, which can be a little confusing for new teachers or therapists who have a meditation background. Can you lay some foundational groundwork for the listeners about what the definitions and differences might be?
Yes, I think I said the first one, which is it is very important that someone's mental health improve when you're in this model of psychotherapy, according to today's standards. When someone comes to you with their suffering in a psychological setting, then your job is to make sure that they find some relief. And that is not a requirement for a Zen person, although it's certainly desirable. So we take responsibility psychologically as therapists to help someone find relief from their suffering. As a Zen teacher, you give someone the techniques for working with suffering, and you may even point out habits and routines that people go through that increase their suffering. But essentially, it's the responsibility of the student to take the practices and use them in a way that helps. So that's one very important difference. The other difference is in therapy, when people come in with suffering, it's very personal. It's based on their personal experience, their early life history, and the people in their lives and the circumstances that have arisen. And we spend a lot of time mirroring those personal experiences. And so the person feels cared for and that there's some larger container for their suffering and that there's some space to reflect. And you kind of are holding the suffering as a person tells a story and maybe even reflecting it back in a different light. But in a Zen setting, a big difference is that we don't necessarily need to hear the personal stories in any detail. Of course, people will come and tell their story about, well, this is why I suffer. And it's certainly based on early childhood and then everything else that has happened since then. But what we teach people is, oh, guess what? You're human. Suffering is the human condition. Now, we can spend a lot of time talking about the specifics of your suffering and how you don't like it and how it needs to change and why it happened. Or we can begin to understand the nature of suffering and how it is that you have a relationship to your suffering and just your own personal suffering and suffering in general. But we're not, even though people need to tell their story to their teacher and so that the teacher becomes acquainted with them, we're not going to examine the details of the specific kinds of suffering. We're going to say, oh, yes, suffering. And what is it you do in your meditation practice when you're sitting on the cushion and you begin to suffer? What are the techniques that you use? What have you found? What will you find to be useful to you in working with your own suffering? And the why and how of it is not, the why is not important. The how, sometimes we will study just exactly how as we sit on the cushion or when we have very mindful moments off the cushion, how it is we take certain circumstances and turn them into a hell realm. But we notice that it's something that our mind does quite automatically. And sort of to catch that process from the teachings of Buddhism. How is it we can't be with the current moment as it is? How is it we wish that we wish it to be otherwise? I call this Witbo, wishing it to be otherwise. Whatever's, we say, I want this to go away. And that is this kind of tug of war that activates the suffering. There are naturally conditions and circumstances that are not pleasant. Recently, I was in my car in stop and go traffic on the freeway, and I had stopped, and someone else behind me decided or wasn't paying enough attention to stop. And I knew that this was going to be just a big load of suffering. But the best thing to do was to let it go rather than to rant and rave about how unfair it was and everything else. Of course, I got whatever medical treatment I needed and took care of it. But I did not have control of the universe at that moment, and actually at any other moment. And so when circumstances arise, how do we interact with them to make it worse? That's basically the situation that we're studying around our personal suffering. It's not that through Buddhism we will have no suffering. We will have some suffering because we're human and because we have a body. But how do we make it worse? And that's a very important responsibility that each Zen student takes on, each Buddhist student takes. So it's different. It's, in a sense, we're more interested in the universality of suffering and how it unfolds, and how Buddhist training and meditation works with the arising of suffering and the awareness of suffering. And we're not trying to fix it, rather to become aware of it. So the personal issues are not so emphasized. And it's very important. And the maturity of a student will tell us whether this is going to be a useful kind of relationship, teacher-student relationship or not, because people will try to sell us to sell the teacher on the inevitability of their suffering, and that their suffering is worse than anybody else's suffering. That's what the stories are all about. And when we take the step back to say, well, actually, you're human, and because you're human, you suffer, then we have to see how they respond to it.
Yeah, so far I hear two very important distinguishing characteristics. First is the onus of responsibility. Within a therapeutic context, the therapist has an onus of responsibility to show improvement and help the patient with that. Within a Zen context, it's the practitioner's onus to do the work that's necessary for whatever kind of suffering it is that they're dealing with. So that's one, that onus of responsibility. And then the other piece is the centrism of the suffering, that within a therapeutic context, it's specific to the individual, to what's going on in their life. It's their stories, their narratives. And with Zen, there is the centrism is shifted from the individual to the nature of suffering itself. So we don't go so much into the stories that the individual is dealing with, and using. I like Whitbo. I think that's going to find a really good quote in here. Is wishing it to be
have
otherwise.
To trademark that.
That's a pretty good one. And Zen is not trying to fix that. That is simply the state of affairs. And so you have a centrism of suffering as well. So those are two pretty big and I think fairly clear distinguishing characteristics. Are there others that you can think of?
Yes. No matter how long a patient is in therapy, they never become a therapist unless they're going through an academic program. In other words, going to therapy will not make a patient a therapist, will not give them any tools to work with other people. However, a Zen student who's working with a teacher personally and doing the practices will become a Zen teacher in this method. So what is different about that relationship is that the projection and transference, the parental projection and transference that you have with the therapist continues. You may work through some elements of it. In other words, some of the elements you had as a child where you felt like you were disempowered by a parent. may work through some of that, but the transference essentially remains in place, even though some work gets done on it with the therapist. The teacher's role actually is to reveal the transference, I believe. So there is transference from student to teacher, but if a Zen teacher is working effectively, in my view, that transference is revealed. And eventually, the student sees that whatever it is that he or she had projected on the teacher belongs to themselves. So at that time, they're fully empowered to help themselves and help others, help all beings. So this is a very different situation. And I want to say more about the transference because I think it's a very important part of therapy. And also, it's an important part of, at least initially, of what goes wrong in the teacher-student relationship. We bring to the teacher-student relationship many ideas about how the teacher is supposed to help us or be this perfect being because they were doing this practice that we have faith in. But what we should be coming out learning, what we should learn from being with the teacher, is that the teacher is not the intermediary to the absolute, not in Zen. Each student has access to the absolute. But in therapy, the therapist is the intermediary to the patient's unconscious and to shining light on dark areas. So the therapist does act as an intermediary. This is a very important difference because you are dependent on the quality of the therapist's awareness and skill, how much you will see about your own personal constructions. But you are not dependent on your teacher's awareness and skill, not in the end, because as you practice and make your own contact and your own relationship with the absolute, you have access to universal wisdom. You are not dependent on the wisdom of your teacher. You have access to universal wisdom, which you do not have access to in therapy unless somehow the teacher is spiritually inclined.
And that ties directly to that responsibility onus as well. It's in your hands as a student.
That's right. As we go deeper in our practice, it is our responsibility to make that connection to universal wisdom or the absolute or, full awareness. And when we're working with the therapist, oftentimes we use the therapist's awareness. So we're limited to how much we can understand. I have had patients tell me very often that they were in situations and they didn't say, I sunk into having no preference and began to see many, many options in the world of freedom. They didn't say that to me. What they would say to me was, when I was in this situation with my mother-in-law, I thought about what you might do. And so they used me and my personality and my skills interpersonally and what I was teaching them to try different coping skills. But we expect a Zen student to say, when I got into this tough situation, my boss called me in to find fault with me. I let go of defensiveness and I was completely at peace with the moment and I found wisdom there. That's a very different kind of access.
That is very different. You're right. This progress or the transference, it is so critical in both contexts. It's not wrong in either.
No, it's very important. But you see, one of the problems and why we train people in this, in our Shogaku Zen Institute, why we train people is because therapists receive a lot of training on transference. They understand how important it is and how to maintain the boundaries and actually make use of it. Because if there's no transference between the patient and the therapist, well, then the patient just sees the therapist as ordinary Joe Schlub and not that much emotional reaction will present itself. when the patient sees the therapist as the wonderful parent that they didn't have and begins to have all the emotional reactivity to the therapist, and that needs to be worked through, then the therapist has to remember all the things they were taught about transference. Oh, I'm in transference now. And become disappointed and angry with me. We're going to go through all these stages. But Zen teachers are not taught that. So people will come in and project this magical healing power on the therapist, and on the Zen teacher. When the student projects this on the Zen teacher takes it personally and says, gosh, what a wonderful, healing, unbelievable, skillful person I am. They take the transference personally. They don't see it as the nature of the relationship. It's a transient stage in the relationship between Zen student and Zen teacher, or between any Buddhist student and master or teacher. So there's a transient stage where the student imagines that the teacher has some special power, and that only through the teacher's attention and love and caring for the student will the student get the benefits of this wondrous material. And the Zen teacher often believes that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the big pitfalls, is that the teacher is still human, and as a therapist, you go through training to remind you you are also subject to all of this, and it can be a very heady thing that leads to some of the problems that we've seen in our sanghas when there isn't that attention.
That's right. I mean, and this is one of the fundamental problems in when we're seeing students falling in love with a teacher, and the women students falling in love with a male teacher, and the male teacher thinking, oh, she loves me. Isn't this delicious? I must be so wonderful. And I'm so special. And rather than seeing, oh, this is a transference, this is a projection, somehow I need to get her to see her own power, her own abilities, and help her to stand on her own 2 feet rather than look to me for all this wonderfulness.
So, Grace, what are some guidance ideas you might suggest to someone in either role on recognizing when a line is being approached and how to steer things appropriately?
Well, we have to know that this projection and transference is going to take place, both in the positive sense and the negative sense. We've talked about the effects of the positive transference, where someone feels a teacher has some magic powers and has projected all this wonderful parental ability and has become an infant again. But there's also the negative side of this. And either one will feel very intense. So all the practice we do about noticing what's arising in the body becomes our responsibility when we become a teacher, of noticing what's arising in the room. So we have to be able to notice rather than repress our feelings or try to go to la-la land and become a Zen zombie. We need to be watching what emotions feel like in the body, and we need to be able to expand the field to include another when we get into the teacher relationship, and we need to feel when that's happening. And we need to approach it respectfully, both on the positive side and the negative side. I think women tend to get more of the negative projection because people tend to feel shorted of the father role and idealize it. Whereas with women, they had plenty of their mother, and it was, basically let me out of here. So when they start going there. So when we feel these emotional tides in our relationships with our students, we need to be able to stop and not be reactive. So this is a very big task. And in order to do it, we need to have people to talk to. So while it's going on is one problem. But then the relationship can kind of get stuck there. So we have to have consultants. We have to have peers that we consult with or teachers that we consult with. And we also need therapists to consult with because our feelings will be activated. As you said, we're all human, and our feelings will be activated in this relationship with students. And pretty soon we either feel that this student is so wonderful because they're enacting the positive transference with it, or we really dislike this person because all they can do is be negative with us or be stubborn with us. So we notice that we like and dislike certain people, and we have certain feelings or certain feelings of dread when we have to work with certain students. This is something to discuss with a peer so that we can get clear. And also, a very important thing is how much suffering. As I said, we don't take responsibility for a student's suffering. But when I see a student who's coming back, who's doing all the right things, showing up for the practice, being there for the retreats, taking on responsibility in the Sangha, and when they come in for private interview, they're still suffering a great deal, then I don't tell them they need to do more zazen or they need to make a bigger commitment to practice. I tell them they need to go into therapy. So there's a point where we can see whether the practice is actually helping or not. And this, to me, is a big difference between a practice situation that's actually transformative and creative and a cult. A cult requires more and more commitment to sustain itself. The purpose of the cult is to sustain itself and its cult leader. The purpose of a transformative spiritual practice place is to help bring awareness to each of the practitioners. So if we see people suffering, what I don't do is say you need to make a bigger commitment to the practice and more time on the cushion, more of that.
Right. It's not the answer to everything.
Yeah. What I want to say is, how is it working in your life? And if people are feeling a lot more suffering, and each time I see them, their relationship at work or their marriages are more stressed or other relationships are stressed, then I say, you know what? You need to do therapy in addition to this. And Joko Beck talked about this. Zazen is not a process that unfolds in some predictable way. It's all of a sudden you may reach a place where you're flooded with memories. So because it's somewhat unpredictable, you need to know when you get into a place and you're overwhelmed by what's been uncovered. I like to say that trauma in human beings causes disassociation. And zazen or other forms of meditation are associative processes. So when people do these meditation, they're going to have associations that they've stuffed away or they've tried to hide from for many years. They've disassociated from.
Avoided or repressed.
Yeah. So this is not systematic. All of a sudden you hit a pocket and it's unpredictable. At that time, you're going to need more help.
So some of the very important points you're bringing up here is, as a teacher, noticing your own reactions. And I see this as one of the key reasons why teachers must have their own highly developed regular practice as well, because that supports their ability to notice.
That's not enough. They need other people, too, that they can let their hair down with and say, I was so mad at that person.
Right. And the other part, in addition to that, is the second part you just referred to, is that peer-to-peer reflection and counseling is needed, that it's not be done in a vacuum.
Yeah. No, what we've done in reading the literature, particularly in Zen, is, there's this person kind of like a magician guru on the hill who's somehow complete in him or herself and doesn't, somehow has this great wisdom. Well, we're not like that, actually. And when we have these peers, and it can't just be anybody, we have to develop these relationships. We have to have friendships. We have to know that person is on our side. They have to know where we get hung up so that when we start talking about the problem we're having, they can see where we've been snagged on our own history or our own feelings. So it has to be someone we're close to and that we trust and that we have a friendship with, and we have to cultivate those friendships. And that's one of the things we do with our Shogaku Zen Institute is we emphasize this class of whatever it is, 13, 15, 16, 20 people. These are the people you're going to call next time you get into trouble. You find some people within this group that you have rapport with and make sure you cultivate that relationship.
Yeah, and understanding the ability to say, I need a hand with this, and that not all things that will be provided to us as information about what we're doing or what people are seeing is always going to be pleasant. And in fact, that can be the most contributive to our own growth, especially in a teacher role.
Yes, well, that's true. Like it or not.
So it may happen that on occasion, a teacher may have wandered into therapy territory, the kind of situation we've just been talking about where, whoops, they're over the line. How might they deal with that to help both the student and themselves?
Well, this is when they need to make the call to appear, and where they also need to have, besides their friend, they need to have a therapist consultant to talk about what just happened. Why did I feel this way? And what's the best way to help this person out of the hole that they're in? Because now they're seeing me as the parent and they don't want to talk to me. And how am I going to get out of here? And it isn't, in a certain sense, it's inevitable.
Right. It's not an unexpected thing.
No, it's not that you've done anything wrong. It's that we're human. And we're carrying around these feelings, and when we get into, as I say, Zazen is an associative process, and we're asking these feelings to come forward and show themselves so we can see the patterns that we've put in place to manage these feelings. So they'll start to come out with the teacher, and if the teacher's skillful, the teacher can say, well, I wonder what that was about. Now, one of the other things that I do when I get into this area with students is to say, how are you doing with this? Do you want me to say more? Do you want me to ask more questions? Is this a good time for us to go deeper with this or not? So I try to give people the opportunity to say, you know what, I'm really feeling overwhelmed. I don't want to talk about this anymore today. Let's come back to it another time. Or, yeah, I'm really feeling stuck here. What else could you say to me to help me see what I'm doing? So I try to invite them and ask them, how are you doing? And do you feel overwhelmed by this, or do you want to go deeper?
Yeah, and we as teachers also need the same safe holding space in our environments that we try to create for our students. That still applies to us. We're still people. We still have the same foibles and challenges.
Yeah, except that we don't get the holding space we'd like to get. When we sign up for the teacher position, Darlene Cohen used to say, we put a Post-it on our forehead which says, bring your suffering here. And it's not always pretty, I'll tell you. So a lot of times we'll receive an attack, and we have to be prepared for that. We don't get the same privileges that our students get. And the students don't get the same privileges that a patient gets. So if a student is starting to be really activated emotionally, the teacher can say, I'm sorry, we need to end this conversation. This isn't what we need to be doing right now. We wouldn't say that when someone's paid for a therapy session. This is getting a little over the top for me. I think I need a break. So we have a little more space than we would have with the patient, but still there's a container function that we have, and so we're going to get bruised emotionally.
Grace, what are some other things that can go wrong in your experience that you've seen happen?
Well, one of the things that I've seen in my own experience is I have to know that when everything's going very well, I've only seen half of the student. I can't expect that that's going to continue on that path. And I call it the other shoe has to fall, and they're very willing to come to everything. They really want to help you. And all of a sudden you become demonized. And my experience of that is, oops, I was expecting that finally someone has realized what a great teacher I am.
Validation.
Validation. And I haven't really looked for what's underneath and why I haven't felt any resistance. And that I've found comes to bite me. When people are too quiet or too cooperative, that I've only seen half of it. And I have to keep reminding myself of that.
It's kind of rough because it's always the quiet ones is a great thought. But when everyone's sitting, everyone's quiet. They're all quiet ones.
Yeah, but there are people who will let you know that things aren't going so well. And that's actually a good thing.
I think sometimes we may run into the situation where a student coming in has a particular expectation and they're on a track that this will help me bliss out or relax or deal with anxiety or whatever it is. And they may have some very positive early on experiences. And Grace, do you think it might be helpful in talking with students that you raise an awareness that unpleasant things can arise too? Do you find it helps to give the heads up that may occur too, and that's part of the practice?
It's a very important technique in therapy to make predictions, and I do tend to tell people, I'm sorry that, this feels really great and you think it's going to fix things, but actually you're going to start seeing some things that you didn't want to see. And I'm really sorry about that. So I do think it's helpful to tell people that. And sadly, it may help some, but actually when they have the experience and the disappointment and the suffering, it's really on them as to how they're going to deal with it, right? That you can prepare them to a certain extent for it, and it's helpful to say that. But when they get to the place where it really hurts, it's an emotional experience. It's not a rational experience. So one of the things that I think you're alluding to is that people come into therapy with the usual Western belief, and maybe it's a universal belief, that there's a magic pill that's going to make pain go away. And so people come naturally with that. And what they realize is, oh my God, I'm doing the heavy lifting here. I'm going to have to experience this. I'm actually the agent of transformation. All of it is going to have to pass through my awareness. Nobody's going to do this for me, and no pill is going to do this for me. I'm going to have to be present for all of this. So when people realize that, that's when they make the decision about whether they're up for it or they're not. So even though you can give them the warning, which I do, I think that's the responsible thing to do. And it's responsible to talk about it in that way and to not idealize practice. But I don't know how much it helps in the long run.
I think it's a very good point that some people will be in different levels of ability with hearing that potential outcome and that potential challenge that they'll run into.
Yeah, hearing it and deciding this is for me or not. Maybe I'll just go back to repeating a mantra that makes it go away. It's maybe too much for me right now.
This mantra is a great thing for a suppression of things I don't want to deal with. I'm just going to keep doing that.
Yeah, that worked. And I tell people, I tell them, if you find something that works, please let me know. I don't think this is a pain-free way to work with suffering or to transform your awareness, but it's the best method I've come up with. If you can find something better, please let me know, because this is not trouble-free, and I want to know if there's something else.
And it can be hard work, and it's in your hands.
Yeah, right. This is the best I've come up with. If you got something better, please tell me.
So, Grace, what particular kinds of techniques are there that might be applied to help with some of these discussions?
Well, as I've already mentioned, awareness of transference is very important. But another technique that I used in therapy as well as in practice discussion is how I arrange the room. I try to keep the room in a very uniform position so that the distance, physical distance between me and the student is always the same. So that if there are subtle energetic shifts, I can pick up on that because I am used to the exact same distance. And if the person feels closer or they're intruding into my space, or if they feel withdrawn and the distance, for example, between the two chairs is the same, then I can feel some of the subtle energies. And it's the same, I keep the same ritual when people enter the room and we bow together. And there are many subtle characteristics that you will notice as you keep uniformity to the practice discussion environment.
Excellent. Anything else?
Yes, I think the other thing I would suggest is that there are rituals, which is as people come into the room, you bow or whatever's customary in your practice place. Perhaps you both offer incense or the student does a different kind of bow to the teacher. But these rituals, when repeated, help people understand and help the body-mind equipment understand we're going to the same place. And it makes it sort of a faster journey that we know we're going to go to this deep and intimate, connected place.
Well, our guest today has been Grace Schireson, and the website to go to that we've mentioned a couple times here is shogakuzen.org, and I will be linking that on the episode page for this episode. Grace, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate your insights on this topic.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. Good luck with your mission.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.